I am now delighted to introduce our speaker, Daniel Alvarenga. Daniel is a Salvadoran-American journalist based in Washington, D.C. He is a writer for Telemundo's English language news show, Radar 2020. He formerly worked as a producer for AJ Plus, a digital channel by Al Jazeera. He regularly reports on politics, social movements, and climate justice in Central America and the United States. He's the son of refugees who fled the Civil War in El Salvador in the 1980s. He studied linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara for undergrad and received a master's in corporate communications from IE University in Madrid. I cannot tell you how special it is for me to personally present Daniel to you. For many years, I did not see the stories of my family as Salvadoran refugees, of people from Central America. Daniel's work seeks to unapologetically center the voices, histories, and experiences from people of the Isthmus, and I am personally thankful to him that my nieces and nephew won't have to experience the erasure that so many of us have experienced. With that, please help me welcome Daniel Alvarenga.
Hi, thank you everyone. I'm Daniel Alvarenga here from Washington, D.C. I'm originally from the LA metropolitan area, which is home to the largest amount of Central American diaspora outside of El Salvador. And I'm in DC where it has like the highest per capita. It's the biggest immigrant group. And yes, so I'm a journalist, like I was introduced by Eileen. I originally, when I signed on to this, I was still working at Al Jazeera AJ Plus. I spent the last 3 years there. So much of this talk is going to focus on my work there, but I'm also now with Telemundo for a new show. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but I'm kind of going to walk y'all through some of the stories that I've worked on, some of the themes that I touch, some of my favorite stories, and sort of what shaped my storytelling and sort of my analysis on Central Americans in the US and just globally. And like Eileen said, part of the reason I got into this was because I was frustrated at the coverage. I was a student journalist like 10 years ago, then I couldn't get a job in the industry. And then I just started tweeting into the void and started writing and started blogging, and then sort of built a journalism career starting 2014 with the migrant crisis that happened that year that centered Central Americans. So, before we get into it, I need to talk about who are Central Americans. So who are Central Americans? Central America is 7 countries. It is multi-ethnic, multiracial, and it is, it's not just Mestizo and European, it's home to a lot of Indigenous folks, it's home to a lot of Afro-Indigenous folks. They don't just speak Spanish there, parts speak English in Belize and certain coasts, Creole languages, and a lot of Indigenous languages. It's a mega diverse region, and it's hard to really encapsulate it, I think. But I'll try to make sort of footnotes on the other Central American countries. But my reporting is going to focus mostly on the top 3 right here, northern top 3: Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador. And I'll get into sort of why that is, and that's sort of been the bulk of my work as well. Those 3 countries. So here we have a look at the Central American population from 1980 to 2015. This is from a piece about how US involvement in Central America led to the border crisis. It's by AJ Plus. I helped produce it. It is on YouTube. So basically, there wasn't a whole lot of us compared to today. In 1980, there was like less than 1 million. Now there's over 3 million in 3 decades. And what happened in 1980 to now? Well, Civil War, neoliberal economic policies in the post-war period of El Salvador, gang violence, a ton of US intervention. And this is a population for all Central Americans in the US, but it's largely made up of people from the Northern Triangle. And the Northern Triangle I never really questioned that term before. You know, when I came into college, it was already being used. I just thought it was like sort of a formal place, a formal way we referred to this place. Um, so, but what was the Northern Triangle? The Northern Triangle is actually, it started off as not really meaning much in terms of, nobody used to say Northern Triangle like in the 90s, in the 80s. But it was a commercial designation. It was a commercial designation, and it usually represents free trade, neoliberal policies in the region. So it started in 1992. It gained popularity with the free trade agreement in Mexico. Um, and it's, okay, sounds harmless if you think, neoliberal policies are harmless, but it sounds harmless, this sort of designation. But it's sort of taken on a different life since this commercial designation. So now the Northern Triangle is just synonymous with death, violence. Here are a couple headlines. I'll translate them for those who don't speak Spanish. Spanish section of the Chicago Tribune called it the Northern Triangle, one of the most violent zones in the world. El Mundo called it the Triangle of Death, the invisible routes of refugees. And then, Sky News has it, if you can't read it, it's too small. The vicious Northern Triangle, the vicious gang war being fought over every street. And then this sort of hopeful one from 2018, the Northern Triangle is becoming less murderous. But the implication is that the Northern Triangle is murderous. And it's through this lens that I came to know the Northern Triangle. I think most of us know the Northern Triangle. It came from a commercial designation, and it became this narrative. The Northern Triangle is also the countries that are coming here the most. As you can see, this is data from the Pew Research Center. You can find it at the Pew Research website. Going into the Trump administration, the last years of the Obama years, you saw a ton of migration from Northern Triangle to the point where it's sort of lumped in on the Northern Triangle, sort of lumped in with itself here and kind of counted as one entity, right? And it started outpacing immigration from Mexico, which has historically been, one of the more constant immigration waves in the country. And around 2014, you started to see a shift. As a Salvadoran, I always constantly grew up meeting people coming from El Salvador. They were coming through LA. They're going to go to their next destination. LA was so close to the border, relatively. I'm here in Washington, D.C. And I don't remember a time growing up. I was born in 1989, the tail end of the war. I don't recall a time where people weren't coming to the US from El Salvador. And that's also can be said for Guatemala and Honduras as well. If anything, the more recent waves are heavily favor Honduras and Guatemala versus El Salvador. We'll get into some of that. So then this happened in 2018, the summer of 2018. I was a year into my job at Al Jazeera. I didn't really produce news videos. I wasn't creating a whole lot for them. I was a freelancer, but I was sort of updating their Twitter. And so I would go through all the breaking news all the time. And I was constantly pitching stories about Central America. It's like, we need to talk about Central America. And everyone thought, like, okay, yeah, Daniel, you're from there. It's a niche for you. You're passionate about it. We listen, we hear you. But there's not a whole lot of audience for the elections in Honduras, for what's going on in El Salvador. And then this happens. Reports started coming out in 2018, mid 2018, that 200 children were separated at the border, at the US-Mexican border. Around 2,000 minors were separated from their family. And we're still seeing some of this play out today. They're still they couldn't find 500 of these reunifications, like 500 of them are still sort of pending and they can't find their parents. Some of these were younger than 3 years old. It captivated the country. These headlines were everywhere. And these images were everywhere. I was, becoming a journalist at this point, and, I was showing all of my clips to my family, right? I was, all of my family I'm the only one who's not a refugee. My siblings are refugees from the Civil War. My parents are refugees from the Civil War. So I always share my stories with them. And I think that at this point is when I started just not sharing them as much, or being a little bit more selective, because it was overwhelming for all of us, to just be bombarded with this news. And it wasn't new to them. They were listening to it on the TV as well. So, but, I'll never forget that moment in the newsroom, that it took, the theft of thousands of children from Central America, for me to sort of start giving editorial opinions, because I was kind of the only expert in the newsroom at the time that really understood intimately Central America and had a connection to it. So I started, taking on a lot of these stories. And, there was also the ProPublica thing, was also another kind of like watershed moment around the same time, the same year, when the children were separated at the border, and there was recording. That was sort of like the evidence, the proof, and that was broke by ProPublica. And we did a video with some of the audio. The border agent goes, "Where are you from?" The child says, "El Salvador," and then, "And you?" And another child says, "Guatemala," and then you hear a cacophony of children crying. And this also captivated the nation. And I was just kind of like, whoa, maybe people are finally starting to listen to Central Americans, or tune into Central American politics and issues. But one thing I've learned in news and just living life, that the attention span for the news cycle for anything really is only so big. And for Central Americans, the amnesia is pretty bad. So these images, we all saw these images plastered everywhere 2 years ago. I know it's not interactive, but I'm gonna give you a second to guess. What year do you think this is from? Since this is the stock image that you see with every story. So when I'm looking a story up on Reuters, Associated Press, I see this all the time. And these are kind of the images that a lot of articles will use as stock images for their articles, but they're not from the Trump administration. These images, though, I'm sure they're still relevant to what's going on. They're not from the Trump administration. They're actually from 2014. It got so bad in 2018 that the AP had to fact check with its own photos. They were being used to accuse the Trump government of, to being used as proof of Trump's policies. When in fact they're actually, truth of the Obama era policy that builds upon the legacy of George W. Bush and Reagan and Clinton. So, I always want to impart that sort of this immigration moment that we're in wasn't just brought about by Trump. It's been a bipartisan strategy for years. Yeah, and these images still get used. They're still pretty relevant to a lot of the news going on. And there's not a lot of stock images from ICE facilities. So I don't blame journalists for having to use this, because there's not a whole lot for us to there's not a lot of people going inside of these detentions all the time, or you get like these doctored PR photos often, especially in the last year or two. In 2019, I started seeing a lot more propaganda style photos. But it just shows that we just have such an amnesia with Central American immigration and sort of the US's relation to that region, because just 6 years ago, the 2014 Central American unaccompanied minor crisis, when 70,000 unaccompanied minors came to the border, these kids, they were like kind of young to like teens. Some of these kids, they're not kids anymore. this was 6 years ago. They're in college classes. They message me on Twitter asking me things. They're part of, you know, the population here in the US now. And we've forgotten about them, you know, we've forgotten about them, and we forgot that we forgot this happened in 2018. And I would say 2014 was sort of like my like journalism origin story, because I was so heated at the fact that like a lot of people were like, you know, how did this happen? How did we get here? And knowing me, I never remember a period where Salvadorans didn't come here all the time, and by extension, other Central Americans. So to me, it was very weird, like that we were acting in 2014 like this was a new thing, and then again in 2018 we acted like it was a new thing. And so I always push, you know, I always push people in the organizations that I'm a part of to really, you know, think a little deeper about the US's relationship with Central America. It's only like 2 or 3 countries away. I know Mexico's massive. But, you know, there was another media moment. There was several media moments. And one of them, and there were several deaths on the border that had happened around this point. But I think what really galvanized people was that children were dying on the border in ICE custody. You know, we have different ones here. It says 4th, 5th, 6th. There was, I think, up to 7 children. There's been probably hundreds of adults that have died in ICE custody since the agency was opened in 2013. You can look at the records. It's not just Trump. It's not even just the Obama era, though a lot of it ramped up in these last administrations. So, you know, these children were dying, and again, it was like, whoa, America is starting to listen. The US is starting to listen. They became symbols. Jacqueline Cal, Felipe Alonso. So Jacqueline Cal, this image here is by a visual artist, Brubes, and this image was in so many protests across the country. So many people printed it out. I saw it at, you know, protests against ICE. These children have become a symbol. Here is Zoe Saldana sharing Felipe Alonso, another one of the children who died of neglect at the border. And then Don Cheadle's photo, Don Cheadle, the actor, the Hollywood actor, his Twitter photo to this day is still Jacqueline Cal, Indigenous Maya girl who was killed at the border, or died of neglect, however you want to say it. But Jacqueline Cal's name kind of was like, that to me, because I know the region, it didn't sound like a Hispanic last name. It sounded like perhaps a Mayan last name. And so I did this story with the International Maya League about these children. And this is a quote from Juanita Lopez of the International Maya League, and I'll read it out. You hear about immigrant children dying at the border, but you don't hear that these are indigenous children dying at the border. And this is from a video I did last October for Indigenous Peoples Day, where we explored why are the majority of the children dying at the border indigenous? Why aren't we asking this question? The headlines buried a lot. These are the indigenous Guatemalan children that have that passed away at the border, and you know, there's another child that died after them, or like died during the same period but was reported later. It was a Salvadoran girl. I don't think she was indigenous, but you know, with these children weren't just indigenous Maya. They belonged to different Maya nations. Claudia was Maya Mom, Jacqueline was Maya Quechua, Felipe was Chu, Juan was Maya Chorti, Wilmer was Chorti as well, and Carlos was Achi. And so I never saw too much dwelling on their identity. as indigenous peoples, they were, called migrant children. At best, they were called indigenous Guatemalan children, but they were mostly just called Guatemalan migrant children in the headlines. And I felt that was leaving a lot out of the story. And so then I looked up what about the indigenous identity of these children informed why they had to migrate. And if you look at the numbers of inequality in Guatemala, the malnutrition rate is high across the whole country. It's even higher, up to 70% in more heavily indigenous populated areas. 79% of the indigenous people in Guatemala live in poverty, 40% in extreme poverty. So what you're seeing here is, indigenous Guatemalans facing more institutional neglect than non-indigenous Guatemalans. And then you sort of start connecting. So like, they're also the ones disproportionately dying at the border, as well as in Guatemala. And they're also being displaced from ancestral lands by palm oil plantations, as was the case of Jacqueline Cal. There's also the issue of language injustice. These are languages of officially recognized languages of Guatemala. There may be more. These are just the ones that the government recognizes. The vast majority of them are Maya languages. One is Garifuna, another one I think is Xinca, that are not Maya. But these are the indigenous languages of Guatemala. There's like 22 to 23 of them, depending on what count you use. And this was a huge part of the story. And eventually people started reporting on this, but I remember when it was breaking, I was just kind of like, do we know where she's from? Do we know if it's from an indigenous area? And for Jacqueline Scott's story, this had a lot to do with it. In fact, 3 Maya languages, not just one, 3 Maya languages, Mamquiche, Canjoval, are some of the most used languages in immigration court, in the top 25. The problem is there is not enough interpreters, and so they're probably not getting the same kind of attention at articulating their migration and getting the same kind of attention that Spanish speakers get. And statistics say that speaking an indigenous language means that you'll likelier to be denied medical care. People who speak Spanish or English already get denied medical care, but there's this another layer with people who speak indigenous languages that they're not listened to. And a lot of the children who died in custody, in ICE custody, were indigenous, may have spoken indigenous language, or they were imprisoned with, as in Jacqueline Gal's case, father who spoke his native language, which is a Mayan language, and didn't receive the same kind of attention. Science papers he may not have understood. And the language barrier that has to do with their identity is huge. It's a huge part of their story. It's a huge part of why they're leaving Guatemala in the first place, not even to say why they're more likely to die in ICE custody. And then there was more deaths. This is the one that really shook me. This really shook me because they were Salvadoran. And it was the death of Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria. I'm not going to show the photo. I think a lot of us remember the photo. They were trying to get to Brownsville, Texas, I think over the Rio Grande, and they drowned, or the Rio Bravo. I'm not quite sure, but they drowned in a river, and their sort of dead bodies were on display on every network. This started such a heated newsroom debate on whether should we show it? Should anyone show it? Just because CNN is doing it, should we do it? And that photo, again, captivated everyone. There was a ton of art about it, but a lot of people don't remember who these people were. And it's, we can make a lot of assumptions that people are fleeing El Salvador, in this case, because of violence. It has this image of violence, the gangs, homicide rate, often one of the most dangerous countries in the world. I think people already sort of have a narrative as to why people are leaving El Salvador. And poverty is one of them, but I feel that, poverty in the case of Oscar Martinez was a bigger factor than violence. So he worked at Papa John's. He made $350 a month. Between him and his partner, they couldn't really make ends meet, and that was their motivation to migrate. And we talk a lot about the military intervention in this country, but so much of the intervention is sort of invisible, and it's economic. It's not just soldiers, it's not just arms, it's not just security. What is the economy like in El Salvador that is making people like Oscar Martinez flee? Here's just a little snapshot of the economy in El Salvador. Incredibly neoliberalized post-war. Remember, the Northern Triangle started off as a economic zone, sort of, and this was a region that was very much economically affected by war, and made it vulnerable, sort of for free trade to come in and sort of rebuild the region. And so, and El Salvador went very extreme with this. We had post-war, we had 20 years of a right-wing sort of oligarchy running things. And they never really stopped running things, but we had 10 years of leftist FMLN. And so, we had neoliberal reforms that privatized telecommunications, banks, electricity. And what this did was it made the cost of especially electricity and telecommunications double or triple for the population. And the economy is dollarized. That's something that's very understated in El Salvador. El Salvador has been a dollar economy since 2001. And so it has increasingly made the country economically harder to live in. So what has made Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras so unlivable for migrants? So sorry, I was looking at a comment. So let me see. So I think, it's very much a very big narrative that gangs, I'm not going to dwell on gangs. I feel that often when I'm asked to talk about El Salvador, or I'm invited to the editorial table in the past, was because Trump says something about MS-13. He calls them bad hombres, he calls them animals, and now we have to respond to it, and we have to talk about it. Long story short, MS-13 was born in the USA, and it has become sort of our prevailing sort of image of ourselves. And there's so much behind the gang at play that works against people trying to make a life in Central America, trying to survive in Central America. One of those huge elephants in the room is US intervention in Central America. And you can't talk about the gang problem without US intervention in Central America, because a lot of those kids were war refugees, for one. A lot of those people came here fleeing war, and then came into Ronald Reagan's America with no safety net, and then got mass deported in the 90s under the Clinton administration, once they went harder on immigration. And the US involvement in Central America goes very far back. Here's a moment from February 2019 where Representative Ilhan Omar grilled Elliot Abrams on the Trump's envoy to Venezuela. Elliot Abrams oversaw a lot of what was going on in El Salvador at the time. And so she used his history to sort of make a case against him not getting involved in Venezuela. And so in that hearing, or she says, in that hearing you dismissed as communist propaganda report about the massacre of El Mozote, in which 800 civilians were brutally murdered by US troops. That included children as young as 2 years old. El Mozote is the biggest scar of the Salvadoran Civil War. My family, who fled in the early 80s, doesn't really know a lot about it. It it definitely it still evokes a lot of resentimiento and a lot of just like feelings for Salvadoran diaspora, because we haven't really seen a whole lot of justice. A whole village was scorched earth tactic, just disappeared, burned, children murdered, women murdered. I went to El Mozote 10 years ago, and 20 or 30 years after the massacre, there's still blood on some of the bricks that make the new the new church, because the original one was burnt down, with people inside. And so Ilhan Omar, somehow broke through the usual US amnesia of Central America and went straight, kind of to the jugular, and not only grilled Elliot Abrams on El Salvador, also about the Ixil Indigenous Maya massacre that happened in Guatemala and the Contra War in Nicaragua. And interest, Googling and El Mozote hit a historical high. It measures it here from 1 to 100, but 100 means just like the peak of what that term has been searched. And that happened in February. That happened, yeah, in February, 2019. And it was a big deal. It sort of, it sort of brought back into the collective consciousness of the US in a rare moment that, like, hey, like, Central American refugees is not a problem that started with the Trump administration. Here's a snapshot of some of the US military involvement in the region, by far not exhaustive. But for the countries that we're talking about, some of the most significant were the Salvadoran Civil War, where 75,000 people died. 85%, and this is according to the Truth Commission. 85% of the acts of violence committed by the US backed or committed by US backed state agents, that is the death squads. The Salvadoran military, it was backed by the US, started with actually Carter, and then Reagan sort of blew up these military budgets and made it this sort of deadly, thing that happened. And Guatemala's war was longer. El Salvador's was 12 years, from 1982. Guatemala's was from 1966 to 1996. 200,000 died. 93% of human violations, almost all of them, were committed by US backed state agents. And the Guatemala Civil War also had the characteristic of being a very, very overt indigenous genocide, where they've even had trials. Guatemala's actually has had trials, and sought justice against war criminals, something that El Salvador is still lagging on, like 30 and 40 years later. And then in 2009, I mean, sorry, that's my cat. In 2009, there was a US-backed coup in Honduras that destabilized the country. It's why you see so many migrants from Honduras to this day. And this is just a snapshot. Like, we're not even talking about the other Central American countries, like the Panama invasion in 1989 or 90, Nicaragua's wars. Sometimes I like to call the 80s just the Central American wars, because there was a stage in El Salvador, a stage in Guatemala, a stage in Nicaragua, and then Honduras was also militarizing, not technically at war, but with us. And the Honduran military committed massacres in El Salvador. El Rio Supul killed hundreds. And they were hostile to refugees from the other countries, and were militarizing as well. And so I often include, when I talk about Central America, I often call it just the Central American wars, kind of like how a lot of people talk about Vietnam and has different stages in different countries, right? But Central America is not super unique. US military interventions in Latin America go as far back as the Monroe Doctrine, like 100 years ago. And as you can see, from 1980 to now, these populations have just increased. Salvadorans being the largest Central American group in the US. So I focus on these three countries, but displacement of Central Americans affects the whole region. Here's an article from Belize. The neighboring countries end up having to absorb a lot of this. It doesn't just affect our countries. Belize will have refugee communities. Mexico has almost 100,000 refugees and asylum seekers. There's around 500,000 refugees and asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle. 300,000 are internally displaced in El Salvador. The displacement doesn't happen when they leave the country often. Displacement usually happens internally first. And this was true when my parents fled. Their villages got too dangerous, so then they went to the capital. And then from the capital, they went to the US. And internal displacement is a huge problem in the Northern Triangle specifically. And Nicaraguans also have sought international protection in the last year. A lot of the migration from Nicaragua also involves Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a big country that receives a big number of refugees as well. So the narrative of Central America is also beyond Central America and the US having just this like really toxic relationship. It's also or Northern Triangle in the US having this toxic relationship. It also involves Mexico, heavily involves Mexico, and it involves the other countries as well. Here's something just to show just the more invisible interventions that make that people may not know about. It's not as overt. One is the DR-CAFTA, which was a free trade agreement similar to NAFTA, and it basically gave multinationals the influence over domestic trade. And in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala that are sort of were recovering from war, a lot of their infrastructure was shaped by these policies. There's a special case also that I found from El Salvador where the US threatened to withhold $300 million in Millennium Challenge Corporation development aid because Salvadoran farmers were wanting to use native seeds and not Monsanto. So this was basically a paid incentive to use Monsanto seeds, which are more expensive. You have to renew them. They don't. How do I say it? You can just keep growing with native seeds. You can just keep growing generation of corn after generation of corn, for example. But with these Monsanto seeds, you have to buy the seeds every time you're going to plant them. You can't just grow your own from the corn. It's this weird, Frankenstein sort of experiment that they're doing with the people of El Salvador. But I got this from the community in solidarity from the people of El Salvador that works on a ton of environmental issues in the region. Another thing that's making Central America unlivable, climate change. 3.9 million climate refugees in Central America and Mexico predicted in the next 30 years. Central America's dry quarter, it's going through droughts. This is especially true in El Salvador, which has the least amount of natural resources because of size. But basically the dry quarter is where a lot of crops are, because of the effects of climate change, and not just climate change, but sort of agribusiness in the region, like palm oil plantations and sugarcane plantations, displacing where people would just grow their food for them to eat, has resulted, and as well as climate change, has resulted in this sort of perfect storm for environmental crises. This region is also prone to hurricanes, prone to earthquakes, prone to volcanoes. El Salvador has an incredible water scarcity problem. Here is a climate activist, a water activist in Salvador, who talks about how unequal, unjust water scarcity is sort of affecting the lives of daily rural Salvadorans. You see, the debate over El Salvador over privatizing water. They privatized everything else because it's a neoliberal economy. So now they're like, oh, how about water? And water is already becoming inaccessible, and some might argue is very privatized now. If you don't have a faucet, which a lot of rural Salvadorans don't, you end up paying almost $4 for a glass or for a jug of water when your daily earning is $6, for example. And this is the way that economic policies and economic principles, neoliberal principles imported from the U.S. make it hard for everyday Salvadorans to live. It's also Central America is also a region that is incredibly hostile for people trying to protect these natural resources, especially true in Honduras, that has been named one of the most dangerous countries for environmentalists. This is in 2017, a year after Berta Cáceres, Lenca Indigenous activist, was shot and killed in her home for opposing a dam. And this photo is more recent. Las vidas garífunas también importan. Garífunas are an Afro-Indigenous group in Honduras. Four of their land defenders have gone missing because the Honduran government wants to put resorts there, and multinationals and the Honduran government prefer to have resorts there than let Garifuna people live on their ancestral land. And I think I'm a little bit over time, but just wanted to sort of conclude with these words by Nana Teresa. Nana Teresa is a Maya elder with the Mayan League, and I encourage you all to check out the Mayan League. But she said this: the governments aren't our governments; they're the governments of the rich, the big businessmen, the landowners, and that encapsulates a lot of Central America and a lot of what's making it unlivable right now, beyond the violence, beyond the headlines. And this is also coming from perspective from an Indigenous woman who is a war refugee and has had to leave her ancestral lands. So, that sort of concludes kind of what I had to say. I think around the 12:40 mark, I was supposed to stop. But if you want to learn more, I encourage you to follow me. These are my Instagram handles, but even more so than encouraging to follow me, I want you all to watch and subscribe to my new show. It is by Telemundo. It's in English language. It's new, and it's not your abuela's Telemundo. And that's where you're going to see a lot of my reporting in the future. But yeah, I wanted to turn it over to perhaps the moderator.
Yes. Thank you, Daniel. And we do have a few questions, so we're going to try to get through as many as we can. So up first, we have Hector Peralta, who says, can you perhaps talk more about the politics of language within headlines? I'm particularly interested in the potential way that Northern Triangle parallels the language of banana republics.
Yeah. The Northern Triangle is not a name that we gave ourselves, right? So we already don't really have any sort of autonomy and autodetermination. Just we were given these names by a businessman who wanted to create an economic zone. And now those economic policies result in so much social unrest and violence that it's sort of become a shorthand for those violent countries. So yeah, I do think it has that sort of connotation now. Maybe a nicer way of saying banana republic. I definitely agree. And I've been called out on unconsciously promoting the Northern Triangle name, but like it also just, the country conditions have been shaped so much by economic policies that like it's hard to sort of extract the Northern Triangle label. And this is why I want more Central Americans to, create and write about ourselves and come up with new ways of naming our region. I don't know if that answers your question. Or was I supposed to type that?
No, Hector, let us know if you have that answered your question. But up next we have Cindy Centeno, who is a Salvadoran-American documentary filmmaker and storyteller as well. Their question is, how do you ensure, what are some of the actions that you take to ensure that you're honoring the people and their stories when sharing their image, voice, etc.? Or more generally, how would you say you practice ethical storytelling through your journalism work?
I think one thing is consent, and and having that consent be very active and very thoroughly explained. You know, I didn't work on this story, but I've seen stories where people will do a story on MS-13 in Honduras, and you know, the people said, yeah, sure, use my face, it's fine. And then they weren't breached onto like, oh, this is going to go on YouTube, this is going to be global, everyone can watch the link. You know, it's not just going to be a little broadcast in a foreign country that people are going to see. So I think it's just informing people as much as possible about, you know, how you're going to use your voice and for what audiences are they being exposed to, and um, brainstorm some of the issues, you know, beforehand. Research what are some of the issues someone could run into. So with the case of Honduras, is it's like, okay, so if this story goes out and they sort of half-heartedly didn't understand what they agreed to, let's say, you know, they send a release form in a different language, and it wasn't explained to them, because even if the release form was in Spanish, like if I'm interviewing folks who don't have access to the sort of type of language they use in contracts, I need to explain that. So it's sitting there and informing the person that, you know, is going to bring your story alive. You know, they're doing you a favor, so you also have to make sure you're not going to burn that bridge and not going to burn them in any kind of way. So with the Honduras case, you know, it turns out that we had to pull a piece because they're like faces needed to be blurred. They didn't understand how exposed they were going to be. And so then, you know, we took a video down because of that, and having those conversations and not skimping on those is how you kind of practice it.
Yeah, thank you. Up next, we have Sandra Sanchez, who is thanking you for all that you do. Towards the beginning, you mentioned how you became more particular about what stories you shared with your family as they became heavier. They're wondering how you ground yourself amid all of that heaviness.
Yeah, community. In community, honestly, I think the reason I do what I do is because I sort of created a community to sort of cope with the Central American Twitter, where I got a lot of my following as a journalist, early journalist, and my family also helps ground me as well. They're part of that. They're part of that. They inform my storytelling. Part of the reason I like to sort of involved in my storytelling is kind of like, hey, I'm working on the story. Like, what do you think from your perspective? Like, you know, I want to tell the story about the war, but like, you know, I have these facts. Does it line up with what you saw? Does it or not? And we have a discussion about it. And you know, sometimes those things are too heavy to get into because, you know, it could be very triggering for folks in our community. And even just sharing news and expecting my community to share it, I know I'm exposing them to trauma. So, you know, I think mental health resources, I'm lucky that as a full-time journalist that I have access to mental health resources, and every newsroom should, because of the vicarious trauma. But on top of that, being Central American, I think there is a lot of work around trauma that we need to do. I encourage the reading of Martin Barro. I think it's called Liberation Psychology, which specifically addresses our war trauma that informs a lot of our other traumas. So mental health and friends. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that. Growing up in a similar way, I very much recognize now that I grew up in both a culture of trauma and silence, and just not knowing why the heaviness was in the room or why things were the way they were. And partly because the stories weren't being told. How do you get to that place to even ask the questions of your family members? What is your story?
All right. So I've been very blessed to have interviewed 2 Holocaust survivors in my life, and they've informed sort of how, you know, the US doesn't have a good framework to talk about war and trauma. Often, like the World War II and the Holocaust is often the most, I think, we talk about fascism and its effects on people. And so I drew a lot as a young person from that, and in interviewing a Holocaust survivor as both a young person in my community, but also as a journalist. One person told me that with a lot of Holocaust survivors, their parents are 2 types. And I'm not comparing the Salvadoran Civil War to the Holocaust, but an atrocity, right? You know, some parents are completely silent. They want to forget, they want to move on because of the trauma. And some parents never stop talking about it. They never want to forget, so they overshare. They maybe overshare too much. They may not have access to therapy, so maybe retelling the family stories is the only thing they can. And I was clearly part of that group, where I was hearing war stories at like 8 or 9 and being like, I had to, my mom telling me that she had to identify her brother in a mass grave because he was in the guerrilla and he was killed by the death squads. And so, I was exposed to these stories early on, and I feel like, it's a blessing in disguise, because yes, it's a lot of burdens, a lot of trauma, but like, I was also given the tools to be able to tell these stories, to seek them out, and to have these uncomfortable conversations. And for my parents to have given me clarity. My parents migrated in their late 20s, early 30s, so around my age. So they were also very mentally astute as to what was going on around them. They saw their society crumble around them. So I was very lucky that I had parents who were open. But if you don't, I say learn about it. And once your parents find, because this is what I also did, once the parents saw that I was learning about it, that I was trying to understand the reality, they also opened up even more. So yeah, that's sort of been my journey with that.
Yeah, I remember, I don't remember when, but I remember seeing your Twitter and you sharing something about like, oh, Salvi parents will just casually throw out war trauma. And that definitely in a really sick and funny way rang true to me. So speaking about Twitter and media, we're gonna go to Emily Almendare's question, who says, thank you for your top-notch Twitter content and your journalism. As a Central American scholar, she can express how much it has helped her own research and organizing work. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how the media that sometimes tries to lend sympathy towards those displaced from Central America often infantilizes the individuals being targeted by state violence, i.e. children. How can journalism, academia, organizing dissolve the idea that an individual community is deserving of rights, respect, often retroactive human decency, and garner public support for their agency and migration without labeling unwavering innocence and passive victimhood as a means of doing so?
Wow, okay, that's a good question. This is something that I'm trying to figure out myself as well. I'm constantly tasked with having to sort of humanize Central Americans in a way that people in a news organization or people online may not be familiar with. And I think part of that is just seeking out Central American voices, to speak for themselves, and also getting Central American journalism and professionals who can speak to it, not just professionals, but also have them in the mix too. Because it's as much as it's as much as it's about getting the right people and the voices. You're not going to get those people unless you are part of their community, unless you're interacting with them. So partially is also getting more Central Americans in the room, and not just Salvadorans, not just mestizos, not just white Central Americans, but like getting people who know how to talk about this community, who can go beyond the passive victimhood and the innocence and tell fuller pictures. So I think it's kind of two-pronged. It's getting the person to ask the right questions, the journalist, and finding the people, and basically opening pathways to Black, Indigenous, and journalists of color in the newsroom. I benefited so much from Al Jazeera being a Middle Eastern focused newsroom with a lot of people of color in the newsroom, and it they talked about issues of war and all that stuff often. So I don't know what it's like being in an all-white institution and doing this. That's part of the reason I went to Twitter, to yell about it. I think if these institutions, academia, organizing, whatever, aren't doing it for you, then create your own path, yell into the void, find people to have this conversation with, because it's not also a conversation that Central Americans we should just be having in the media and public. It's something that we should be having with ourselves and people in our community. But yeah, that's a difficult question. I don't feel like I answered it too well, but it's something that I still struggle with.
I got a message separately from Emily saying that that was a great answer. So thank you. As a follow-up to that, about a year or two ago, we had a different Poynter fellow journalist who was American with no relational ties to the Central American region, award-winning journalist in their coverage of gang life in El Salvador. And you mentioned earlier how these are often how we're depicted, right? So it's either we're victims or we're criminals. What is responsible reporting, specifically for journalists that are looking into the area from an outsider gaze?
Can you repeat that last sentence?
What responsibilities do journalists have that are reporting in the region that are looking at it from an outsider gaze?
Very simple. Listen to Central Americans, right? That's been frustrating with me too, because these are people in the industry that I've had to become friends with and learn from. And these are the sort of the gatekeepers in the industry, but it's this fine line of being able to voice your critique, but also not upsetting the gatekeepers. It sucks. It's in a lot of industries. It's in academia. I don't honestly concern myself too much with those people, all the time. Like, obviously I have to write to their gaze often and counter that, but instead of putting my energy into correcting every white person, every white journal who gets something wrong, that's energy that I could be putting into the Central American community, mentoring other journalists, elevating the voices of people who are talking about this in an appropriate way. It's jarring. It's jarring. It's jarring. It's part of the reason I came into the work. I don't really know if I would have been in journalism if it wasn't for 2014 and me being just so pissed off at how mainly white journalists were covering, like, oh my God, where do they come from? These migrants, why are they so violent, right? And also, sometimes we need to read this stuff to keep up to date, but I think, just always being relentless with the critical gaze and, don't be afraid to challenge these folks who are gatekeepers in media and industry. Don't be afraid to challenge me. People challenge me about the Northern Triangle stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. And I wish we had time for all the questions, but I'll one final one. I'm going to go to Jesslyn Paz, who also happens to be the president of our Central Americans for Empowerment student group at Yale. She asks, do you have any advice for young Central Americans who want to tell stories about Central America, but not exclusively on trauma, but also joy, family, community, etc.?
Yes, write about those things, create about those things. You may not think there's an audience for those things, but there totally is. When I think of an account that focuses on a lot of Central American joy, I would say there's an account called Central American Beauty that just shows the beautiful things of our isthmus, the vegetation, the diversity of its people, the traditions, the richness of it, to tell those stories. My only advice is to tell them, and who cares if people don't want to hear them. Put them on your Instagram, put them on Twitter, put them on Medium, and then people will come. We don't need the validation so much. I don't get the validation from my peers in journalism. I get my validation from what my community says about my story. If they like the story and it informed their worldview about us, then that for me is a win. But I struggle. I want to tell more stories about, the good things that happen in Central America too. I think the closest I got to it was Salvadorans, Palestinian Salvadorans. I did a 10-minute history explainer about that. It still included war, obviously, but it was a lot more about the cultural traditions, and just do it. Don't wait for an opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you, Daniel. This has been such a joy to have you here. I wish that we had more than an hour. I'm sure our audience members have lots more to ask. So please follow Daniel. Could you quickly mention again your Twitter handle or information?
Yes. I mean, if you search for me, Daniel Alvarenga on Twitter and Twitter and Instagram, I'm the first thing that comes up, but my handle is, let me write it in the chat. let's see if that'll be helpful. My Twitter handle is at Dan Alvarenga, @ Dan Alvarenga, and Instagram is at Salvi_Prince. I've had that account for a while and it's just become a thing. It's not super professional, but it is what it is. And don't forget to watch and subscribe Radar 2020 if you want to see more of my stories in the future.
Great, thank you. And to all those watching, please follow other Central American journalists and writers and scholars. We're out here, so representation definitely matters. Finally, I want to give a huge thanks to Yale College alum Alfredo Calvo, who organized all of this last year, but unfortunately we couldn't make it happen as the pandemic happened, but here we are. So thank you for your work and labor of love for your peers. And that's it. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.